commodify it, sell it, and that young country makes an immense amount of wealth by just taking over indigenous land spaces. On top of that, continuing to ramp up the use of stolen indigenous peoples from Africa to build everything at that point in time. So the reality of what's going on in North America at this very young period in U.S. history is really that indigenous peoples over most of what is North America hadn't even seen European people yet. And they've been stewarding these land spaces for so long, but European countries are taking huge swaths and just drawing lines on maps and saying, this is ours, you know. But the reality is just the indigenous peoples are still out there living the way they always have. We don't even really form what we know as our borders until the middle of the 1800s, when the Treaty of Guadalupe is signed in 1848, where we finally have that southern border defined, which is what we still have U.S. and Mexico today. But it's just really important that we remember how fast this happens and how much violence happens against Black and Indigenous peoples during this time period. Because during this time period, again, like over 80% of that land space is stewarded by Indigenous peoples the way it always has been. And at the end of that century, less than 2% of that land space will be there only because of the reservation systems that were left and that are still mostly in place, but have still been being dissected over the past century. And so it's just really, you have to understand, like, the U.S. government is extremely aggressive. California wipes out almost its entire indigenous population basically in the 1850s and 1860s. They do a census in 1870, and there's less than 14,000 indigenous peoples left to count after there had been hundreds of thousands of them at the beginning of that century, largely because of bounty systems where they made it not only legal to murder indigenous peoples, but people got paid up to $200 for body parts of indigenous peoples. And if you do the math of inflation of what is $200 in 1860, it's an immense amount of money that people were making. And there's these stories of bounty hunters coming into town after massacring communities and just body parts all over mules and donkeys and horses, and they cash in all that money. The newly formed territory pays out all those bounties, and they get paid back the United States government for basically wiping out that entire state. There's a book out there called American Genocide that chronicles just the known factual pieces of what is considered genocide during that time period of U.S. history. And we just have to remember that during this time period when U.S. colonialism is in full effect, like, the whole land space changes so quickly, you know, because as people come into areas like Minnesota, Wisconsin, wherever, and even like in some of the mountainous regions, they just start ripping up the earth, just taking whatever resources are going to make them a lot of money. Entire forests are just taken down. And it's just extreme environmental destruction at a really rapid rate, you know. And you can imagine, like, if anybody's been out hiking and have ever come across some old growth forest before and how massive some of those trees are, just imagine what some of these forests would have looked like if they had been just let to grow like they had been for so long. You know, so what we also see is just a massive destruction of indigenous agriculture and farming, because there was a lot of indigenous farming and agriculture out there, and we see so much destruction of crops and seeds. And there's just like there's definitely written history of how advanced, especially a lot of the tribes on the East Coast where the colonizers get there, because the indigenous peoples are the ones that show them how to survive. They give them seeds, show them how to grow the seeds, all these things, because they had been doing it for a long time, you know, and they felt bad for them, right? But they had been growing out these massive communities with all sorts of amazing agriculture, with so many cool varietals of seeds. And it's our very first president that really sets the tone of the relations of this new government towards indigenous peoples. The first thing that he does when he's a brand new president is order the complete destruction and devastation of the indigenous settlements, and he wants the complete enslavement of everybody basically in that area, because he's basically mad at them for siding with the British at the time, you know, because we're still at war with Britain up until the early 1800s. You have to remember that part of U.S. history too. So he sends General Sullivan out in 1779, and it takes General Sullivan a single summer because the natives heard he was coming with this massive army, so most of them flee, and he just leaves behind complete destruction. So he just burns everything all the way down, all the way across this march. And it goes from May till September, and at the end of September he writes back and says, I have fulfilled my duties, there's not a single sight of an Indian on this side of Niagara. And just completely wiping down, and you can read about people who were along that journey and just the amount of devastation they were leaving behind. Like, some of these villages would have upwards to 6 miles of farming going on around them, you know, and just really clear-cut roads and paths, and just, it was very advanced civilization that was happening at this time period. So still today in some of those languages, like in Haudenosaunee language, the word for U.S. president literally translates to town destroyer, that they still use today for the word for U.S. president. And we just see, again, like he sets that tone, and this happens basically throughout the rest of the 1800s. We see a lot of aggression. We see Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act in 1830, which is better known as Trail of Tears, where he comes up with this plan to take all native people, strip them from their land spaces, push them into a new territory in the middle of what was nowhere to them at the time, and create Indian country, which eventually becomes Oklahoma. So that was their plan, was just creating an Indian territory to push everybody into that one particular space. We see a lot of land grant colleges that happen because of the Morrill Act, which justifies the usage of all this stolen land. And all of these land grant universities that are still out there today are still benefiting from these old pacts, from this old act, from this Morrill Act of 1862. And it's definitely worth looking into if you're interested in that kind of history, because there's somebody broke it down, and they should be called land grab universities, really, when it comes down to it. We also see the Homestead Act of 1862, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the Dawes Act of 1887. All these things are stripping away rights and humanity from Indigenous peoples, justifying land spaces, taking over land spaces and the theft of those and utilization of those. And it's just a really dangerous time to be Indigenous on this continent during these time periods. In Minnesota, when the Dakota tried to rise up, they're quickly defeated in the scheme of things. A lot of them escape, flee to the west, and the rest of them are gathered up and put into a concentration camp, which is this picture outside of Fort Snelling, or in Fort Snelling, basically. And then they passed the Dakota and Ho-Chunk Expulsion Acts in 1863, making it illegal, putting a bounty system in place to murder Indigenous peoples if you see them during that time period in Minnesota, with high bounties again. And then they eventually, those acts get passed into law, and I'm almost guaranteeing those acts are probably still on the books, because I don't think anybody's ever reversed those two things. So it's probably still illegal to be Dakota or Ho-Chunk in the state of Minnesota still right now today, until somebody does something about that. But what happens to this group is they're put onto riverboats, pushed down the Mississippi River to where the Missouri River meets, and then they're pushed up the Missouri River, dropped off, and then pushed over to what becomes Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota, which is where some of my mom's family comes from that long boat ride. Almost half the people on that boat ride perished because of the situations and just the status of what it was like on that situation. And again, there's so much violence, and it's hard to even unpack what happens. And then after the hanging in Mankato, I can't remember the name of the general, I'm spacing it, sorry, but he gets the green light to go after everybody that escapes, and he tracks them down just inside, just a little bit, not too far from here at Whitestone Hill. And they tried to surrender, but then they just immediately attack, and they just completely massacre this group in Whitestone Hill, like very close to where we are right now. And if you go to, has anybody ever been to the Whitestone Hill site, right? And what's there, like what do you see? You see this huge thing with a giant cavalry soldier on top of it, overlooking the grounds, right? And it's just kind of crazy, and nobody even knows about that massacre hardly at all, because it's not talked about, but it's a really awful one that happens. And again, so close to where we are right here. And this happens all over the place. This is a poster that was from Denver just before the Sand Creek Massacre, where they just wipe out an entire community there with the promises, because we didn't even have foreign military at that time period. Everything was basically militia still. The Civil War was going on, but they were still just pulling in a lot of people that had no experience. So a lot of this is militia. So they would gather these militias, especially in the western states where they're mostly still territories, and they would just promise that if you join up, we'll take out this community and you can take whatever you want home with you. Basically, would be the promises of that. So it's just so much violence is all I'm trying to get to, and you can read many, many more instances of that, about that across there. And again, these histories are really important to understand, because we should understand all of this pain that happened to Indigenous peoples and Black Americans today, and just understand how that's affected all of us in our communities as we move forward right now. So we also see an immense amount of loss of food access when it comes down to all of this as Indigenous peoples, because not only are we losing land spaces, things are being overhunted, our crops are being completely taken over, all those kinds of things are happening. And we hear things about how the U.S. bison disappeared But the U.S. government doesn't really own up to being the ones that actually did it, because they paid for the decimation of that particular animal, because you can read passages in Congress of what they're talking about back then, and they were talking about some people were on the side of just committing outright genocide and wiping away all indigenous peoples, and some of them came to a conclusion that if they took away some of their food sources, they'd be easier to defeat, so they start paying to wipe out the bison. And they do it in such a vast number because there was hundreds of millions of these animals out there, and they're completely taken down almost to extinction by the 1870s. And it's very much in the history. If you look through and find it, there's passages like this: "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Or this one, it says, in 1874, United States surveying parties report that there are 2,000 hunters on the plains killing animals for hides. One party of 16 hunters reported killing 28,000 alone in just a single summer. And that was all over the place, So what's most damaging to us as indigenous peoples was not only this intense violence, but really what it came down to is, why don't we have Native American restaurants everywhere? Why do we have very little indigenous perspective history in our history books, A lot of it's because of the complete eradication of our own histories, of our own stories when it comes down to it, and these assimilation efforts that happen. Because we should be understanding there's so much to learn from indigenous peoples, because we had been here for so many countless generations, So my grandparents' generation at the turn of the century, they should have been downloading thousands of generations of knowledge, which is our indigenous knowledge, which is our indigenous education. If you take the time to define indigenous education, that's what it is. It's those thousands of generations of knowledge being handed down, how to do everything, how to live sustainably with the world around you. You're understanding all these plants and all the uses for them and all the traditions that come with that, right? But instead, we're pushed into boarding school situations, and we're forced to cut our hair and speak different languages and learn a different religion and just be completely homogenized into something that we're not. Because if you look at this picture, if anybody's ever been to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where the first boarding school starts, these kids are coming from all over the place, and their parents are basically being bullied into sending their kids by saying, if you don't send your kids, then you're not going to get any food rations or clothing or anything, And these kids are put into train cars, shipped to the East Coast, and put into this. And again, this is a military-run school, so there's very harsh punishments, and these kids have to face all sorts of just sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, and death. There's a huge graveyard there that is a third of the size that it used to be, because it took up too much space on their campus, so they moved all the bodies and put it into a smaller area. But those gravestones are still there, and you can look through, So we've been there a couple times and left some tobacco and some offerings for them. But it's just a really intense history that happens. And this isn't the only one. This is just the first of them. So these boarding schools pop up all over the United States. And I know that Deb Holland created a reporting system to start to really dig in to find out what really happened from the U.S. government perspective. But as indigenous peoples, we always knew what was going on. And we see this happening in all of these colonized areas: Alaska, Hawaii, of course Canada. Canada, they call them residential schools. And if anybody's been following the past couple of years of how they started searching the grounds of these residential schools, and just within a few of these schools, finding thousands of unmarked graves, because again, the indigenous peoples knew what was happening, but it was being covered up constantly. And so many of us, like my mom's generation, my mom won't talk about boarding school because she tried to run away, and her parents luckily pulled her out, but she saw a lot of stuff that she will not talk about. There's a lot of trauma that people still have to unpack from boarding schools at those time periods. So what happens to us, and that's just the 1800s, how are the 1900s going for us, right? So we're not actually citizens until 1924. And during that exact same time period, they realized that they didn't have any kind of rule sets or laws to discriminate us officially, so they had to create the Racial Integrity Act in 1924 to follow suit with that, with allowing us to become citizens. When Nazi Germany was coming up, they started researching who out there around the world had any kind of legislation or laws written in about how to officially designate segregation and racial bias in their laws. Of course, they come across the United States because they obviously were doing it with Black and Indigenous peoples, but they found that their methodology was too violent for them, so they moved on, And anyways, we know what happened there. But, so we also go through a really intense couple decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, dismantling more tribes, which is usually just an attempt to take their land spaces because they're sitting on more valuable resources, which would be land resources mostly. What's not talked about too often is the Indian adoption era, which goes from 1941 to 1967. And the statistic from this report by the Association of American Indian Affairs says that 1 out of 3 children are taken from Indigenous families and put into non-Indigenous homes. And that's not a small number. That's almost 3 decades where 1 out of 3 Indigenous peoples are put into non-Indigenous homes, which is just another form of cultural genocide if you want to break it down and unpack that piece, you know. And then we can't vote until 1965, like many people of color. And growing up in South Dakota wouldn't allow votes up until the 80s because they weren't taking votes from unorganized counties, which meant the native counties, basically, right? We couldn't celebrate religions until 1978, which is in a lot of our lifetimes, you know. And I'm not calling anybody old here. I'm just saying that I see some gray hair out there, so I just know. And I'm almost 50, so it was in my lifetime. And I just, you know, that's insane because our country is always going on about freedom of religion and it just didn't count if you weren't Christian, basically, right? And there's still persecution going on today outside of Christianity. And, you know, so like how is post-colonial Native America? That's 1900s. How are we doing today? Like that's where the question is now. And, you know, we're not doing that great because we're still facing, and colonialism hasn't actually ended, like I said, because there's still aggression towards Indigenous peoples in many parts of the world. We're still we're still looking at basically extraction for profit. You know, obviously Dakota Access Pipeline is a good example. Things like that. We're still holding these things over humans, basically, you know. So that's just the way, that's where we're at. We haven't gotten very far because we're not a very old country, and that's the point of going through this history lesson, is that we haven't come that far in a couple hundred years, and we have a lot more to go through. So, you know, for me, this is what my pantry looked like, kind of, because I grew up with mostly commodity foods growing up. You know, I grew up on my grandparents' ranch, so we did have access to some beef, and we did hunt, you know, we did gather things like chokecherries and timsalo, which is a wild prairie turnip. But, you know, for the most part, we had a lot of commodity foods growing on. You know, because I get, obviously, a lot of attention and media requests, and people always ask, like, you're from a reservation, what kind of foods did you grow up with? Because they want to hear the cool story, you know. It's like, oh, I'd get up in the morning, take down an elk with a slingshot I made, feed our whole family feast, gather a bunch of things along the way. But that wasn't the reality of it, because the reality of it is that we're living in an impressionistic, segregated state still as reservation systems, you know. And we had all of these commodity foods, you know, and it's not fun because I have issues with commodity foods. Like, sure, we have made some great recipes out of it. Sure, we have some family recipes that are like comforty, you know, but overall it's not good for you because there's all these like fruits packed in too much sugar, like pure corn syrup, all these vegetables packed in too much sodium, and just all these white carbs all over the place, you know, powdered milks and all these just rices and cereals and things, and it's just too much, you know. And as Indigenous peoples, we can't even break down those carbs, so it just turns into health diseases for most of us. It just turns into obesity, which turns into heart disease or type 2 diabetes or whatever, you name it, you know. And we didn't even have like those fancy cans with all the colorful pictures growing up. We just had the black and white cans, you know, just beef with juices, pork with juices, you know. It's just that with juices is the selling point to that stuff, right? And it's not, this stuff's barely fit for humans, really. If you open up a can of it, you're not going to tell the difference between that and a can of dog food at all when it comes down to it, you know. So, and I remember as a kid, like, we grew up way out in the country, so our bus was just this big old yellow Suburban, you know, and it would pick us up on the dirt road and drive us into school. And then we would get there, and when we got to school, we'd have to have some kind of nutrition, so they would force us to eat breakfast, or they'd make us eat breakfast, I should say. But it would usually just be some government cereal, some powdered milk, and then there would be these little paper cups with a shot of juice in it, you know. And the juices were typically orange juice, apple juice, or tomato juice. But since we were the last kids every single day to show up, all we had to choose from was room temperature tomato juice, you know. And that was awful. Like, having to down that was not a good memory for me, but whatever. And so, you know, it's just important to think about what we had growing up. And, you know, Indian tacos, fry bread tacos, whatever you want to call them, like, they're fun, they taste good, they're not going anywhere. I just chose not to showcase them because I feel like we could do so much better as Indigenous people. This one food shouldn't identify all of us as Indigenous peoples across the board because we have too much diversity, and this really didn't have anything to do with us anyways, you know? If you identify, or if you decolonize this one dish, like, you take away the fry bread, because we didn't have that, that was given to us by the US government, and show us what to do with staples like flour and lard, salt, sugar, and things like that. You can replace the ground beef with something else, with some other meat. You have beans, cool. You have some kind of greens, not iceberg lettuce, but some kind of greens. And we definitely don't have weird California black olives. We definitely don't have cheese or sour cream, you know. But, you know, our food is so really cool when you think about it. We have so much diversity to celebrate, and that's what I like to teach about is what are Indigenous foods, and it's a showcase of diversity and understanding that. So understanding Indigenous food systems, you know, we just have to connect. We have to go outside and think about things, you know. We just have to look at the world around us, you know. I always tease that our kids can name more of Kim Kardashian's ex-boyfriends now than they can tree species, you know, and that's our education right now. So we need to really think about what we're teaching not only our children, but ourselves, you know. We should be taking the time to connect with the world around us, to see the value, because our Indigenous ancestors had relationships with all the plants. They knew the songs to sing when they're harvesting, and what offerings to leave them, and when to harvest, and how not to damage the plants, and to make sure that these plants regrow for the next cycle of things, right? And so to understand Indigenous foods, it is an understanding of diversity, because just look at how complicated North America is. It's an immense, massive area of space, you know, and there's mountains, there's swamps, there's deserts, there's plains, there's forests, there's Arctic and subarctic and tropical, there's everything, right? And so we just have to, and then when you layer Indigenous peoples on that, you can see how much amazing diversity is out there. One way to see that today is just at a language map. So if you look at Indigenous language maps, you know, just imagine driving across this nation in any direction, stopping at Indigenous-focused businesses, you would experience all of that diversity, you know? Because every few hundred miles, it's a different language, there's different stories, there's different mythologies, different religions, and obviously different foods and preparations of these foods everywhere you go. So we still have 634 tribes in Canada, 574 in the US, which 228 are all up in Alaska. 20% of Mexico identifies as Indigenous, and almost 8% of Mexico still speaks Indigenous languages over colonized languages, you know? So it doesn't matter who's speaking English, French, or Spanish, those are foreign languages to this land space, right? All of those are foreign languages. We need to really understand what's the true backbone to everything, what's the true root system, which is the Indigenous roots, right? And there's no comparison to colonial settler states to the Indigenous territories. There's just too much diversity. And we shouldn't be homogenizing everything. Because what really showcases North American food, it shouldn't be Coca-Cola and hamburgers, you know? Like, right now I feel like I travel so much, and I go to so many restaurants, and I could pretty much write the menu to every restaurant before I even walk in, because it's always the same, you know? You always have a Caesar salad, you always have some kind of flatbread, you always have some kind of bacon, bourbon burger thing going on. Like, there's just all this stuff, you know? So like, we just need to be a lot more creative, and we should be really showcasing our regional diversities, and we should really be paying homage to the Indigenous groups and peoples that have lived out there for so long, and all these cultures that have come in. You know, we have so much work we can be doing around foods, and food is such a powerful language. You know, so for me, this didn't just become a situation of teaching about Indigenous foods, but it really becomes an opportunity to talk about Indigenous education. Because when we're looking at Indigenous education, which was those thousands of generations of knowledge being handed down, it's an understanding of all of these pieces. You know, it's wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, Indigenous crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, history, star knowledge, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, and more. You know, so I want to create a path where we can stop looking at education and academia only from a Eurocentric perspective, but looking at it from all the rest of the Indigenous peoples from around the world who have so much to offer, right? So let's look at North American foods, right? I think that protein is the easiest choice because literally anything roaming around out there is game. Like everything moving can be game, and it can be calories for people if we want it to be, right? We learn about the bison and how Native Americans use every part of it, which is extremely generalized, but it's not untrue because we had to be resourceful as Indigenous peoples, and we were taught that because we had thousands of generations giving us the knowledge of what to do with everything. We're so wasteful today. Like, we literally buy something and throw it away moments later. Like, all we do is create trash, you know? We have so much of it, and we could all be a lot more resourceful. And we took this perspective not just with the bison, but with everything. Like, any animal we broke down, any fish that we broke down, any plant that we're utilizing, because we had that knowledge of what to do with all of these byproducts of things, right? could be food, it could be medicine, it could be lodging, it could be tools, it could be all sorts of stuff that we create out of everything. So we just have to stop being afraid of food, of meats, especially. I mean, if it's not a cow, a pig, or a chicken, which those three things didn't even exist on this land space not that long ago, we should be really understanding of all the animals that are out there and how they can be utilized, you know. There's all sorts of amazing seafoods, of course, and even insects, you know, because like it's so normal in many parts of the world. And out of Wamini in Minneapolis, I put insects on the menu, and when we're busy in the summer, I'm probably going through almost 20 pounds of crickets a week, you know. That's a lot of crickets to be selling at a fancy, and we're not even a fancy restaurant, but I'm just saying, like, that's a lot of bugs to sell at a restaurant, you know. And I'm happy that people are trying them, because we should, again, open up our minds, try something different, and just be aware that there's other food sources out there. Because we have a lot of food issues that we're going to come through in the future, and we'll talk about that a little bit more too. But you know, we have to be a lot smarter and a lot more open about the kinds of foods that we eat and what we're doing and what's going to become more sustainable, and really start to think about those things. You know, plants for me is a really easy way to connect to my ancestors as an Indigenous person, because I knew that my ancestors had so much knowledge of the plant world around us, right? So if you just open up your eyes. This is a picture from North Dakota, just in the Dakota Prairie region, in the middle of summer. Like, most people just stand out there and see nothingness, right? You just see a bunch of grassland and really beautiful skies. But like, there's so much food out there if you just open up your eyes. You know, there's buffalo berries, and choke cherries, and all sorts of things are out there, right? And you know, and it's just, you know, understanding how Indigenous peoples are surviving, because as humans, we need certain building blocks to be alive. We need to figure out how do we get energy, which is either going to come from carbohydrates or fat, right? So like, this is the picture of timsala, which is a prairie turnip, and there's other forms of carbohydrates that other groups used in other parts of North America, like camas root, you know, or here in Minnesota, where we're so lucky to have true wild rice that's out there, you know, and that's a really important thing for us as Indigenous peoples, and we still celebrate it today. We still have so much connection to these plants because they're so life-giving, you know, and we should be understanding of that. It's not just a commodity on the food shelf, but it's something that has a relationship to us, and it's a deep meaning, you know, when you look at food differently like that. And just that knowledge of water plants in general is big, because any of the coastal tribes out there knew so much about the water plants and were utilizing them for basically everything. Or people in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you or maim you, right? Indigenous peoples knew very well how to utilize those plants. And it's almost silly to use a term food desert, because Indigenous peoples who lived in the desert saw nothing but food around them, right? You just had to learn how to look at the environment and see it and have those relationships with the world and the life around you. Agriculture. Agriculture is something that we should talk about more when it comes to Indigenous perspective, because we're kind of taught that we're kind of at the pinnacle of what modern day agriculture is. But we know what this style of agriculture is actually doing and the damage. Like, we have to be aware of it, you know, because we're creating more deserts really than anything else. And the amount of chemicals that we're pushing in to this stuff, you know, we know it's happening, you know, because these dangerous chemicals are not only getting into all these plants, and it's hard to even get away from it, because these plants are in the middle of every part of the middle of your grocery store. You know, it's hard to get away from all the soybeans, all the corn product, all the wheat product, all the stuff. It's just all in there. It's hard to even avoid that stuff. And so if you see titles like, how worried should we be that glyphosate was found in our Cheerios, like, you should be really worried. Like, that stuff is super scary. You know, so we need to be knowing what's going in our food and be a lot smarter about what we're putting into our bodies. But we can almost not get away from it, because those chemicals are not only getting into those foods, but they're getting into the soil, getting into the water. That water's getting into our towns, getting into our neighborhoods, getting into our houses, and getting into our bodies, right? It's all over the place. And we're not even going to know what's going to really happen to us until a few years down the road. We're just lab rats, basically, for these giant chemical companies. What happens when we microdose massive amounts of these dangerous chemicals for so long, after 20, 30, 40 years, you know? We're going to find out. We'll see what happens. You know, hopefully we'll get some superpowers or something, but we'll just see. I don't think it's going to go that way, though. If we break down how Indigenous agriculture was going on, like, Indigenous agriculture is amazing, the history of it, because corn culture, especially starting at the bottom of Mexico, Belize, and that whole region, the Mayan Empire area down there, shooting both directions into North and South America. So it shoots all throughout Mexico, all throughout the entire Caribbean, all the way up the eastern seaboard, all the way up to Mississippi and Missouri river valleys, and there's just a massive amount of region where agriculture lands. And the typical indigenous agricultures has different varietals of corns, beans, squash, chili peppers, cotton, tobacco, sunflower seeds. There's all these amazing products and so much diversity of the seeds that are out there, So like if you ever go to Mexico City, you just have to think about what it looked like before it's Mexico City, because they built this entire city kind of like in the lake basically, but they had really clean, they didn't have to poison their food systems to feed hundreds of thousands of people. And they're growing all these beautiful crops, and very extremely organically, And you can follow that corn culture in history all the way up in the Americas. This is a Zuni farm in what is New Mexico today. They figured out how to farm in the desert for thousands of years, and irrigate that. And they're growing the same varieties that they were with the Aztec and Mayans, with this corns and beans and squash and chilies and sunflowers and all those things. And some of us might know about Three Sisters systems, where you grow the corn, you put the beans down, and the beans will crawl up the corn stalks, and you put the squash down, and the squash helps cover the ground around it, and it just keeps everything kind of tight. And it's a symbiotic growing system, This is a very particular East Coast style farming, because as indigenous peoples, we didn't just have one way, we had multiple ways because we're diverse, right? So it's not just one way of farming, not just one kind of corn seed. Like, there's so much diversity out there. And it's just really fun to explore that history. There's a book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, Buffalo Bird Woman's Hidatsa, and if you look in the picture, you can see the Missouri River Valley behind her, and it chronicles her life, it chronicles her memories, it chronicles a season in her garden, it chronicles the seeds that she's growing, the tools that she was using, like the buffalo shoulder bone hoe you see in that picture. And she's using more of a row system for her seeds, and there's many amazing diverse seeds that are saved from the 3 affiliated tribes out here. And we are lucky to have these seeds still today. And they're growing the same things as they were way down in Mexico, just different varietals of it, because things change over distance and over time. But it's just really amazing. So you have to remember that every one of these amazing seeds has so much story behind it to tell, and so much life behind it, and just so much history behind it. And we need to protect those, because there's companies out there trying to buy up all these seed diversities, trademark them, and control them, because controlling food is controlling people. It's a power move basically. But we have to do everything we can to steward these seeds and to allow them to stay in the hands of indigenous peoples who know the stories, who knows the connections, and they're our relations. They're part of our histories, a part of our families when it comes down to it. And protecting these diversities so future generations have access to them. So we have no choice. Somebody has to do it. It's got to be us. We can't just let somebody else do it. We should all be really worried about the control of these foods and making sure that they stay out there and these diverse seeds stay alive. I've been to so many museums, like Field Museum. They had 100,000 different cobs of corn in their archives in the basement. They're literally just in shoe boxes in the basement. And because they're so old, almost none of them will germinate. Because those are living beings. They have to go back into the ground and have that life cycle happen to them. So we have to do whatever we can to protect what we can, because we have no idea how many seeds are lost in the aggression in the 1800s with the burning down of so much amazing North American agriculture that was out there at that time period. So what do we do with all of this knowledge? That's kind of where we are with trying to just understand how do we move forward. Because for me, I just want to pay respect to my ancestors. I just really want to pay respect and do something. But I'm not trying to cook like it's 1491. I want to cook like now. We're in a modern day. It's a different world out there. We have different plants. There's everything. But I want to look at it from an indigenous perspective. So I don't want to spend $50 on chemicals to try to kill off dandelions in my yard. I'd rather eat them because they taste good and they're good for you, for example, right? And and we just have so much information at our fingertips, because you can literally take your little smart device and just download an app, take a picture of the plant, and it'll tell you what it is with pretty solid accuracy. And it just gets better and better. Like, we have so much information at our fingertips. There's no reason to not learn and not to create relations with the world around us, and just to open up our eyes. So instead of just seeing weeds everywhere, and that just means you don't know what it is if you're using that term, like, we have so much that we could be utilizing. There's a whole beautiful world around us, and it's up to us to try to figure out how to create that relationship with those plants and with this world and utilize it. Plant diversity is good for our diet, and taking the time to just make our own pantry items, like preserving things, letting things dry out, because that was the main way of food preservation, and just like, making things taste like where we happen to be. Like, it's not that hard. It's fun just to use foods that taste like where we happen to be at. And as a chef, it's fun to make food look beautiful and pretty, but we have to put some intention behind it, because these dishes, they're very specific. They come from very things. Like the one in the top left, there's some bison, some chokecherry sauce, some wild greens, some wild prairie onions, some sunchokes. Those are things you just find on the plains. You can just find those things growing around. Or here's a picture of rabbit, cranberries, wild rice, white cedar, maple. You can see all those ingredients just standing in one spot and just looking around. Like, it's that easy to make food taste like where you live at, and that's how we should be looking at North American food. That's it. So there should be a difference between what is South Dakota food to North Dakota food, what is Minnesota food to North Dakota food. Every few hundred miles, again, everything changes, and we should be celebrating region and culture and history and diversity, right? And keeping things simple. Like, we don't have to overcomplicate things. Sometimes food is best just let the way it is, Just let it be. You don't have to put all sorts of butter, fat, and salt on everything. You can just taste food for what it is, We're just too used to consuming all this extra sweet, all this extra sugar, all this extra salt, all this extra fat on everything. And if you cut that all away, you start to actually taste the food for once, So it's really important to think about that, and that's what we try to do at the restaurant. And for us, we just want this food out there in the tribal communities, because so many of our reservation systems don't have access to these foods. Even though some of it's just around us and it's in our peripheral, we're not utilizing it. We don't have the education to. And we can change that, though. That's all things that we can attain to, because we just really want to get these foods back into the hands of Indigenous peoples and try to curb some of these foodborne illnesses that we're creating for ourselves. Like, we're literally making ourselves sick, but it's only because of the access of food that we have. And we can change that, So it's worth thinking about all of these pieces. So how do we reclaim Indigenous health and culture through food, It's through education when it comes down to it. And I just really want to help, because I've had cousins my age who have passed away already because of type 2 diabetes, and that shouldn't be that way. I'm already over the age that the average male lives to on Pine Ridge Reservation right now. And that's crazy to me. And again, it's a food access issue, it's an oppression issue, it's a segregation, it's a racial issue. And we can change these. These are things that can be changed. We don't have to live that way. So when I started coming up with business ideas, I just wanted to see if it was possible. So when I opened up my first project, which was Tatanka Truck, which I did with the Little Earth Community of United Tribes in South Minneapolis, I wanted to try us out. What if we just serve healthy native foods out there, And as we're opening up this food truck and kind of teasing online and using social media, we were seeing people really excited, but I knew that most people were excited because they thought there was going to be fried bread on the truck. And I was worried, what's going to happen when they find out there's no fried bread on that truck, But it was okay. We didn't get chased out of town. It was cool. We were able to, it worked. It worked, We didn't have Gatorades and all these energy drinks and all these things with all these extra calories that we don't need. We served white cedar and maple tea. We served bison, we served venison, we served walleye, we served northerns, we served all these. We tried to purchase foods from Indigenous peoples. We tried to set the tone, and it worked. So I started the Sioux Chef in 2014, really just to try to do this work. I thought maybe a restaurant could be something, would be a good platform for people to see what's possible with modern Indigenous foods. And it's working. Because we just won Best New Restaurant in the entire United States last year. And that's almost an impossible feat for a restaurant like us, because we're not fancy. I've been to fancy restaurants, and we're not like that. Because I've been to restaurants where they charge you, because I'm a chef and I get to go to some of these restaurants sometimes, and I know they're charging people $500 for a dinner for one person, which is crazy, right? And it's fancy and it's interesting, but is it that interesting? It's hard to say, It's up to you. It's up to, that's just the way food is. It's personal. But we can do something. I feel like we just did something intentional, But usually those big awards, like those James Beard Awards for Best New Restaurant, Best New Chef, those kinds of things, those typically go to Eurocentric, culinary projects, and it's usually, that's just the way it is. So to be able to stand out with all of that, that's pretty huge, And people are literally flying into Minneapolis just to come check us out, but we should not be so rare. There should be native restaurants like us everywhere, and we can do that. That's possible. And that's part of the reason I created this nonprofit called NATIVES, which is an acronym, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, which has two main goals and two main pillars, which is just creating access to Indigenous foods and creating access to Indigenous education. And we're doing this through a public space in South Minneapolis in the Midtown Global Market called Indigenous Food Lab. Indigenous Food Lab we opened in early 2020. We actually were, I got my 501c3 in 2019. We started a capital campaign to raise money because originally the idea was to open up a restaurant, a commercial kitchen to do a lot of education and training and development, a classroom so we could teach about Indigenous foodways and just Indigenous education in general. And so we found this space in January of 2020. We moved in and we went through all the lawyers and all the things to sign the leases, and at the end of February, I was like, I'm gonna go to Mexico for my birthday, and when I get back, we'll sign these leases. And as I was in Mexico, the pandemic rolled out, so when I got back, it was a whole new world, you know? And then so we just had to just set that project aside for a second, because what do you do? Who could have foresaw the entire restaurant food industry just collapse overnight? And it was intense, because that was what we did. At my catering company, everything just fell off. There was just none of that. I had to get all my employees. Luckily, there was unemployment support. We got everybody up on unemployment. Everybody just sat at home for a little bit, like we all did, And I remember those, I remember just kind of going crazy because I'm used to moving around and doing stuff. And first I was putting together 1,000-piece puzzles every day, one a day literally. And then I started making sour bread like everybody was doing and failing constantly, which was super frustrating. I taught myself how to do the Rubik's Cube in under a minute. I taught myself how to oil paint. That was just the first month. And then, right after all that, George Floyd happens in Minneapolis, and everything changed again. Because not only were we in this pandemic, but people were just pissed, because people were so tired of seeing this, and tired of seeing the cops cover up for themselves for all this kind of continued violence that's been happening since the beginning of this country, basically, And, so the Indigenous Food Lab is on Lake Street, where all of the violence and all of the destruction happened. But the community wasn't, the community that's from there in that area, nobody was upset about it because it was a statement. That things had to change. So people are out there every day, cleaning up the streets, making everything look nice again, and just helping people again, And, when we started, because we had this kitchen, we just started doing food relief. So we started just doing 400 meals a day, serving mostly the homeless population that was in South Minneapolis, which was unfortunately largely Indigenous. We just wanted to get healthy foods out there, and we were just kind of unapologetically serving healthy Indigenous foods because that's what we do, And at first people would be like, I don't want that, what is that, And it's well, it's wild rice, it's hominy, it's bullshot it's all these things. We're I want a Subway. It's well, this is what we got, And then but eventually, we kept coming, and pretty soon it was people were trying it and liking it. And they're can I have 5 of those? Yeah, have as many as you want, And it's good because it makes you feel good. Eating Indigenous food makes you feel good, because our diet's gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, all those things. Every fad diet's trying to get to what we already are here in North America if we just ate an Indigenous diet, we finally are able to get to what we're actually doing today. At the height of the pandemic during the winter, we were sending 10,000 meals a week out to 9 out of 11 tribes in Minnesota, and just kind of setting the tone for what we're trying to do. But really what we're trying to do is just become a regional center point to really help develop more Indigenous food operations around us. We want to work with tribal communities. We want to work with Indigenous entrepreneurs. We want to develop more food systems. We want to develop more food projects. We got USDA licensing so we can be micro to mid-sized co-packers to help get more products on the market. And because the pandemic, we decided not to open up a restaurant because we were already opening up a restaurant. We're not going to open up 2 restaurants during the global pandemic without a really bad idea. So instead, I shifted the restaurant idea into a market space. We're about ready to launch a native market in Minneapolis, and that's something that we can replicate and put all over the place, just so we can have access to Indigenous food products. And we're doing that all through the nonprofit, so we can help subsidize some of these foods if they go on to tribal communities. I want to work with tribal convenience stores and make them give up just 2 shelves of chips and put up 2 shelves of Indigenous foods. It shouldn't be that hard, right? So hopefully that's kind of the vision, sort of some of that. And we're about ready to launch a native digital education studio too, so we can teach all sorts of Indigenous education on everything. It could be language classes, it could be history, it could be food preservation, it could be all these things, and it's doable. And we're going to record everything we do with video stuff and just make it available online so everybody has access to it, and invite people in. If they want to teach about quill work or beading or language or cooking, whatever, we can create a space where they can make some extra cash to teach what they already know and love how to do and share it so it goes online and we can share it with everybody. And our goal is to just create all sorts of Indigenous education. because there's so much benefit to indigenous diets. Healthy fats, diverse proteins, low carbs, low salts, immense plant diversity, organic agriculture, celebrating cultural regional diversities, regional and seasonal based food systems, and it's all about getting towards indigenous food sovereignty, which is having these things to get there. We need healthy food access, we need cultural food producers, we need regional food systems, and we need local control of those food systems, which means non-governmental control, because we don't need the government telling us what we can or can't do based on who's lobbying them at the time, right? And then we also need access to indigenous education, and we need environmental protections, which is extremely important, So when we see a lot of indigenous peoples rising up to fight for things like trying to keep oil out of waterways, which should be like a big duh, we should be supporting those ventures, because we should stop damaging the environment with the purpose of extraction for profit, which is just continued settler colonialism as we move forward. Because it's not a matter of if. This is a map of where all the pipeline leaks were between 1990 and 2011, but it's not a matter of if those pipelines leak, but when, and how much damage will they leave behind, and will our future generations have access to some of these foods and waterways. And we're already going through water crisis. We already need to be more careful and smarter as it is. We want to push for more community gardens, more permacultural landscapes, meaning we shouldn't have giant lawns doing nothing. We should just be putting food plants everywhere, plants that like to grow here, and just put them all over the place, right? Because lawns are stupid. It has no purpose for us, right? It's a waste of time. I know people like tooling around with lawnmowers and shit, but we just need to get rid of them, And I'm going to pick on Palm Springs, because Palm Springs has 120 golf courses, right? The desert should not look like that. But if we have the ability to make the desert look like that, we shouldn't be doing that for golfers. We should be making food for everybody, right? There's so much water crisis happening in California right now. And the same thing, I love wine, but if you ever go to Napa Valley, it's a beautiful, amazing valley that can grow pretty much the entire year. There's one single crop out there, and it's using way too much water. And as much as I've tried, you cannot survive off of wine alone. So we really have to, just think better. We have to be smarter humans. The Oglala Aquifer is something that I grew up with, because it's on the northern edge of where I grew up in South Dakota. Our windmills tapped right into it. And it goes all the way from Texas to South Dakota. It's the largest body of fresh water in North America. It's disappearing at a fast rate, because we're allowing companies like Nestle to tap as much as they want for $500 a year, for the sole purpose of just making trash in the form of plastic water bottles, right? We need to be way smarter than that, because we need to be thinking about food and food access and water preservation everywhere, because water crisis is real. It's happening right now before our eyes. There's no legislation happening about that right now. We have to protect that fast. So our goal is to open up these indigenous food labs, not just in Minnesota, but in every region that we absolutely can. We're choosing to do that in urban areas, because each urban area can be a regional center point to help develop. And we're already creating our first extensions in Anchorage, Alaska, Bozeman, Montana, and Rapid City, South Dakota right now as we speak. And we're going to continue to grow more and more, again, and just being able to be that support system to see more indigenous food operations. People are asking me if I want to open up more restaurants. I don't want to open more restaurants. That's too much work. And I don't like being locked in a box. I want to get out there and do this work. I want to help show people and open up people's minds of what's possible, and be a support, set up support systems for other people to do it. We can do this. And we need commercial kitchens, because we need to be able to process these foods in a healthy way. We need to be able to just know what to do with wild foods and how to preserve them. Because one township alone, if they just set aside a few acres for permaculture and agriculture, they could feed their whole town, So we wouldn't have to worry. I think the pandemic showed us how vulnerable we are to our food systems, and school systems where they're we can't get this weird chicken breast from who knows where it's coming from, or this weird sauce, or whatever it is. But if, for us, we were buying everything from local people, so it was easy to know what we had. We're just helping the local people grow. That's what's more important. We need that, and we need more indigenous food producers out there. We need those opportunities. Land access is a huge issue. Still today, if you look at all privately owned land in the United States, 98% white, which is a direct result of the settler colonialism history that we just went through in the past couple hundred years. We need to do a lot more. We need to do a lot better with all of that too. We need to see a lot more indigenous food producers out there. And that's just some of the support system that we're trying to do, because we truly believe that if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, because that's what our indigenous ancestors were doing, And so Owamni, if you come down to Owamni, just come and try. Just come in and visit. You know, in the summertime we have a ton of patio space. It's easy to just come in and get a table that way. Wintertime it's a little smaller, but we're built right on what used to be a really beautiful waterfall. The Dakota name was Owamni. The Anishinaabe name was Gichigakabika, which meant Great Split Rock. In Dakota, it meant the place of the falling swirling waters, basically. But it was such a sacred place because there was a Dakota village on the side of the river that we're on for who knows how many generations. And it was a place for portaging, a place for meeting. It was kind of like a capital because in Dakota language, the Mississippi is called Hahawakpa, which means river of the falls, which meant that one spot. Like we're on the heart of the Mississippi right there. You know, and Badote is another sacred spot just down the way, but in Minnesota and Mississippi River Valley. But I feel so lucky, and it's almost like weird, just weird that our first project, like this restaurant, ended up right there at that exact spot. You know, it's crazy a little bit, but that's the way it's supposed to be. I have always known I'm on the right path ever since I've started this work. And I can see a lot of this work that's happening in the future, and I'm just moving forward. I feel like some things have just been pulling me, but I feel like I already know what to do. And sharing is a big part of that work, you know. And creating these intentions of trying to prioritize purchasing from Indigenous producers first, locally and then nationally, and just opening up a lot of demand. Just with 2 kitchens open in Minneapolis, we're able to spend tens of thousands of dollars towards Indigenous producers, you know, and just be a huge support for that. And we can continue to grow like that. And there's just so much opportunity for more Indigenous creative. We have 120 employees at Owamni, and last statistic was a little over 70% of our staff identified as Indigenous, which is huge because, you know, for especially a very non-diverse city that we live in, like that's a big number, right? So it's really important, and we just truly believe that the future is Indigenous, but we all have to do this together. We all have to play a part of it somehow, even if it's just being aware of it, you know. But we have to do something. So for me, that's why we call it an evolution and revolution of Indigenous food systems at the same time, because it's a little bit of both. That's my talk, a little bit over time. Thank you guys for listening, and we're going to go try some food.
Thank you all so much for being here. Can we give one more big round of applause for Chef Sean? That was amazing.
Can you guys tell me still? Okay. So we just made a really simple dish. It's just a native grain bowl. We have Potawatomi corn that we turned into Owamni. Potawatomi is from the Michigan area, one of the tribes out there. And then we have some red lake boiled rice, and we have some tepary beans from the southwest. And then we have some smoked duck from an area in Minnesota called Pequot Lakes. And then we just have some berry sauce, which we call bojapi, which is traditionally it's choke cherry, but it's just a mix. So it's just a very simple tasting of these foods. It's really super healthy, and so there's a ton of it, so please come and try some, take some home. Thank you.
So very quickly here, I just want to thank our partners that made this happen today, bringing Chef Sean onto campus. The Educational Event Funds by MSUM, Dragon Entertainment Group, Sodexo, and ASA, our American Student Indian Association on campus. So without further ado, we can all start making our way to Keezy if we'd like to try some amazing food tonight. If you do not know where it is, you can follow the crowd. We have some signs up there, some people helping. And if you are from the community today, there will be a price fee at the door when you get there. If you are a student, you can use your current meal plan, or we have meal tickets for our current students. Thank you so much.